My dear students, welcome to this module. Here we will discuss about Vietnamese communism, World War, and its impact in Vietnam and its independence, and then the first Indochina War. So, in the class, we had discussed about the first two stages of nationalism in Vietnam. So, the communism part, it's nothing but the third stage of nationalism in Vietnam, where an important personality emerges, and he obviously would become the father of modern Vietnam. He is none other than Ho Chi Minh. So, it is obviously an extension of our classes. Okay, so kindly listen and make use of it. So the year 1930 was very important in the history of Vietnam for it another reason. The first reason, I said, VNDQ was also formed, Vietnamese National Party, and it was a revolutionary organization. So they made an attempt with the help of military. The military coup had taken place, but it was repelled by the colonial government. So the year 1930 was also important for it another reasons because 5 years earlier, a new figure destined to become the most prominent leader in the national movement had appeared on the scene as an expatriate revolutionary in South China. So he was Nguyen Ai Quoc, better known by his later name, Ho Chi Minh. So in June 1925, Ho Chi Minh had founded the Revolutionary Youth League of Vietnam. So it was obviously the predecessor of ICP, Indo-Chinese Communist Party. So this party is very, very important party. Okay, so which will pave the way for Vietnamese independence. Ho Chi Minh had founded the Revolutionary Youth League of Vietnam, the predecessor of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. So he had left Vietnam as a young seaman in 1911 itself, and he traveled widely before settling in Paris in 1917. So he was not a person who used to live in a single place. So before becoming a leader, before founding a ICP, okay, he traveled many parts of the world, particularly in China. So wherever the communism was in its budding stage, okay, he traveled there. So he settled in Paris, France in 1917. He joined the Communist Party of France in 1920 and later spent several years in Moscow, Russia, and China in the service of the international communist movement. So after making the Revolutionary Youth League the most influential of all clandestine resistance groups, he succeeded in early 1930 in forming the Vietnamese Communist Party. Okay, from the 1930, it called the Vietnamese or Indo-Chinese Communist Party. So both refers to same thing, Vietnamese Communist Party or Indo-Chinese Communist Party. So in May 1930, communists started protesting against French rule for their exploitation. So in Vietnam, the French government exploited the resources of the Vietnamese over large areas of central Vietnam by staging a broad peasant uprising, during which numerous Vietnamese officials and many landlords were killed. So these communist insurgents, they killed numerous officials, the French officials or Vietnamese officials working under the French government, and landlords were killed. And Soviet administrations were set up in several provinces of Annam. So in the central part of Vietnam, many areas were occupied by the communists and they set up a Soviet style, the communist style governments there. It took the French until the spring of 1931, almost 1 year, to suppress this movement and in an unparalleled wave of terror to re-establish control. So the French, they took so many efforts, particularly the terrorist efforts were taken by the French government to suppress the communist insurgency in Vietnam, particularly in Annam. And unlike the dispersed and disoriented leadership of VNQDD and some earlier nationalist groups, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, they recovered quickly from the setback of 1931. So they were so smart, they recovered, all right, relying on the cadres trained in Soviet Union and China. After 1936, when the French extended some political freedoms to the colonies, the party skillfully, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, they skillfully exploited all the opportunities given to them. And they also made efforts to bring Vietnamese Communist Party or ICP into the legal front organization, and through which it extended its influence among the intellectuals, workers, and peasants. See, till 1936, ICP was more or less a revolutionary group. But in 1936, the French colonial government in Vietnam, they gave certain political rights to the natives, through which ICP got its legal entity, and it tried to influence the intellectuals, workers in and peasants, more importantly, in Vietnam. When political freedom were again curtailed at the outbreak of the World War II, the Communist Party, now a well disciplined organization, was forced back into hiding. So they once again became an underground organization. So this is all about the establishment of ICP, Indo-Chinese Communist Party, and its leader, Ho Chi Minh. Now let's see a World War II and independence. So for 5 years during the World War II, so World War II fought between the Allied and Axis powers in the years 1939 to 1945. So during the 5 years of World War II, Indochina was a French administered possession of Japan. So on 22nd September 1940, Jean de Cox, the French governor, appointed by the Vichy government after the fall of France to the Nazis, we concluded an agreement with the Japanese that permitted the stationing of almost 30,000 Japanese troops in Indochina and the use of all major Vietnamese airports by the Japanese military. So, for almost 5 years, Indochina was in the hands of the Axis powers. So, the agreement made Indochina the most important staging area for all Japanese military operations in Southeast Asia. After the French had been disarmed, Bao Dai, the last French appointed emperor of Vietnam, was allowed to proclaim the independence of his country and to appoint a Vietnamese national government at Hue. However, all real power remained in the hands of the Japanese military commanders. Okay, so they were the real masters, but Baodai, the emperor, and his appointments were just for namesake. Meanwhile, in May 1941, at Ho Chi Minh's urging, the Communist Party, they formed a broad nationalist alliance under his leadership called Vietnam. Okay, so an alliance called Vietnam was formed under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh in 1941. In May 1941, Ho Chi Minh, returning to China to seek assistance, was arrested and imprisoned there by the nationalist government in China. So, Kuomintang government under Chiang Kai-shek arrested the communist leader Ho Chi Minh when he went there. After his release, he returned to Vietnam and began to cooperate with the Allied forces by providing informations on the Japanese troops' movements in Indochina. So he was a communist, but he cooperated with the Allied forces, okay, on the Japanese movements, particularly the French and the Americans. So at the same time, he sought recognition of the Vietnam as the legitimate representative of Vietnamese nationalist aspirations. When the Japanese surrendered in August 1945, the communist-led Vietnam ordered a general uprising, and with no one organized to oppose them, they were able to seize power in Hanoi. So Vietnam under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. They organized an uprising and they occupied power in Hanoi of Vietnam, particularly after the fall of Japan in 1945. Mao died, the Vietnamese emperor abdicated few days later and declared his fealty to the newly proclaimed Democratic Republic of Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh. The Communist Party had clearly gained the upper hand in its struggle to outmaneuver its disorganized rivals, such as the non-communist VNQDD. So the French, however, were determined to restore their colonial presence in Indochina, and with the aid of British occupation forces, they seized the control of Cochin China. So the South China was seized from Vietnam by the French with the support of the British. Thus, at the beginning of 1946, there were two Vietnams, a communist north and a non-communist south. A communist north, that is Hanoi, was in the hands of the communist, that is Ho Chi Minh, whereas South Vietnam, that is Cochin China, was in the hands of the non-communist, that is the French. When we take the first Indochina War, negotiations between the French and Ho Chi Minh led to an agreement in March 1946. That is after the setup of Vietnam and particularly after the re-establishment of the French rule in March 1946 between northern Vietnam, that is under the control of the communist led by Ho Chi Minh, and southern Vietnam under the control of France. They concluded an agreement in March 1946 that appeared to promise a peaceful solution between two parties, the French and the communist. Under the agreement, France would recognize the Vietnam government in northern Vietnam and give Vietnam the status of a free state within the French Union. French troops were to remain in Vietnam, but they would be withdrawn progressively over 5 years. So France promised to withdraw the French troops in Vietnam within 5 years. And let's see how far they kept the promise alive. Okay. So for a period in early 1946, the French cooperated with Ho Chi Minh as he consolidated the Vietnam's dominance over other nationalistic groups in Vietnam, in particular those politicians who had backed by the Chinese Nationalist Party. So all these people were came into the forefront, supporting Vietnam, particularly Ho Chi Minh, for a early period in 1946. So, despite political cooperation between the French and Vietnam, their policies were irreconcilable. The French, particularly the French, aimed to re-establish colonial rule, while Hanoi wanted total independence. That is, the French, they wanted to re-establish colonial rule, particularly they wanted to occupy the northern part of Vietnam. On the other hand, we had the Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, in northern part of Vietnam to occupy the southern part, Cochin China. Okay, so both parties were a little bit aggressive in occupying the other areas. So French intentions were revealed in the decision of Georges Thierry de Argeneliu, the High Commissioner of Indochina, that is French Indochina, proclaimed Cochin China as an autonomous republic in June 1946, which they're not supposed to do. But he did. Okay, George did that. Further, negotiations did not resolve the basic differences between the French and the Vietnam. In late 1946, French naval vessels bombarded Haiphong, causing several thousand civilian casualties in northern part of Vietnam. That is, Haiphong was a area under the control of the Vietnam, that is the Communist Party. So the subsequent Vietnam attempt to overwhelm French troops in Hanoi in December is generally considered to be the beginning of the First Indochina War. So the war between the French in southern Vietnam and the communists in northern Vietnam is known as the First Indochina War. Initially confident of victory, the French long ignored the real political cause of the war. So, the desire of Vietnamese people, including their anti communist leaders, to achieve unity and independence for their country. French efforts to deal with those issues were devious and ineffective. So, the French, they were not so serious. They thought that the anti communists might support them because anti-communists were against communism. Okay, were against Vietnam. But unfortunately, they supported, that is the anti-communists, they supported the nationalist parties. Okay, they were anti-communist, but they were not in favor of the French rule in Vietnam. So the French were disappointed in this regard. So the French reunited Cochin China with the rest of Vietnam in 1949, proclaiming the associated state of Vietnam and appointed the former Emperor Bao Dai as chief of state. Most nationalists, however, denounced these maneuvers and leadership in the struggle for independence from the French remained within the Viet Minh. So, without consulting Viet Minh, the French had undertaken all these measures and made Bao Dai as the leader of the state. Okay, they formed a union called Associated Republic of Vietnam. Meanwhile, the Viet Minh waged an increasingly successful guerrilla war against the French, aided after 1949 by the new communist government of China. People's Republic of China was proclaimed by Mao Zedong in 1949. So he supported. So Mao Zedong's communist party, communist regime in China supported Viet Minh. So the United States, fearful of the spread of communism in Asia, sent large amount of aid to the French. So the French, however, were shaken by the fall of their garrison at Dien Bien Phu in May 1954. So the French, they were not happy. Okay, so the French forces were obviously surrendered. Okay, so the America, okay, United States of America were not happy with the spread of communism in different parts of Asia. Initially, their allies, Russia, turned into a communist state in 1917 as USSR, and then later on, many states became communist. Okay, so the Americans were not happy, so they were totally against. In 1949, China became a communist state. So America don't want Vietnam to be a communist state, so they helped France. Okay, so the French, however, were shaken by the fall of their garrison at Dien Bien Phu in May 1954, and they agreed to negotiate an end to the war at an international conference in Geneva in 1954. So the first Indo-China War came to an end in 1954 with the signing of Geneva Conference. Okay, with an agreement was signed by two parties in 1954 at Geneva, Switzerland, where both of them agreed to end the war, and Vietnam was recognized. Okay, as a state. So both, like the French, they decided to leave Vietnam, and northern and southern part of Vietnam were united, and then Ho Chi Minh proclaimed as the leader of Vietnam. So the Geneva Conference of 1954 is an important epoch in the history of Vietnam, where it led to the formation of a new state under the communist leadership. Okay, and it also led to the exit of French from Vietnam. So, which brings to an end to the First Indochina War. Thank you.